Simply put, the roguelike is a genre of games which uses procedurally generated levels and permadeath for near endless experiences. It's built off a core structure of content that can basically be reshaped and restructured for almost endless possibilities. And roguelikes have been a subgenre in gaming for a really long time. I mean, going back as far as 1978 with Beneath Apple Manor, which used procedural generation to create its world. And shortly thereafter, Rogue, which is usually considered the father of the genre, would come along in 1980 and would cement the idea of not only procedurally generated game with near endless possibilities, but permadeath. And of course, Rogue was a popular game for some. Others said that it's the biggest waste of CPU cycles in history. The genre would see some releases after Rogue, but in my opinion, it was criminally underutilized and largely abandoned until the indie scene brought it back to life. And this kind of makes sense, right? The indie scene, limited resources, limited manpower. You're going to want to squeeze every inch of life out of all of those assets and art and gameplay mechanics that you create. So procedurally generating things just saves time. It makes sense that it kind of took a bit of a hiatus. And I would personally give credit to The Binding of Isaac. No, not that Binding of Isaac, this Binding of Isaac, released as a Flash title in 2011, as being largely responsible for popularizing the genre in modern times. And since the indie explosion, tons of roguelikes are out there, and this genre is absolutely thriving. But like I said, it's thriving in the indie scene. And we have covered some of these on the channel. The first 3D multiplayer hit, Risk of Rain 2, the first first-person shooter multiplayer hit, Gunfire Reborn, and of course various aspects of The Binding of Isaac, as well as other rogue-style games on this channel. And all of this is great, but like I said, these are indie games, and the genre has never really truly broken into the AAA scene until Returnal. And who better to bring this game to life than Housemarque Games, a Finnish studio who until now has been making smaller indie-like titles. Perhaps more importantly, these smaller titles vibe with the popular subgenre layered onto roguelikes, bullet hell. So Housemarque is almost the perfect studio to help make the roguelike genre glow up. They're experts in common roguelike themes like bullet hell, and they're looking to bring a largely indie genre into the AAA space, while they themselves have been a smaller studio looking to move into the AAA space. So does Housemarque succeed in bringing this too often ignored genre into the limelight? Well, let's find out. So Returnal is technically a roguelite, not a roguelike. Light uses some, but not all of the design elements of a roguelike. There's permadeath, there's procedurally generated maps, but many games end up tweaking the formula, usually in a way that allows for some form of permanent progression. And with that little nitpick out of the way, I want to explore what Returnal is, how it deviates from a true roguelike and makes itself a roguelite, and comment on exactly what it brings to the table as a new piece of software. And also, just full disclosure going forward, I'm just going to say rogue instead of roguelike or roguelite, because those sound way too familiar and the nuances aren't going to matter much going forward. And so now that we're all PhDs in rogue subgenres, well, what is Returnal? Returnal is a 3D game, it is a bullet hell game, and it is a rogue-style game with the AAA treatment. But where it breaks from the typical rogue tradition is interesting and often novel to the genre. So there's two forms of currency in Returnal. One resets when you die, and another persists run to run. And now this isn't new for rogue games, but it is nice to comment on, and it's a nice way to allow you to tip the scales if you've been saving up. If you feel like this is the run, then you can burn that currency that you've been saving. Or if the run is not going too well, and you know that you're not going to make it much further, or you know that this run is just not rolling the RNGesus style god play pulls that you need, then, well, you can just farm for currency and still feel like you're accomplishing something, even though the run is effectively dead. And there are also permanent upgrades, and these are a little different from most roguelikes I've played. This is more like a Metroidvania. So these permanent upgrades are going to help you on a run-to-run basis. Like, they're going to grant you a melee attack, for example, or a grapple hook, which increases your locomotion. But where the Metroidvania aspect comes into play is most of these upgrades either gate immediate progression or can be used in earlier biomes for more pickups. So, I mean, that means essentially the further you get into the game, the easier it is because of these permanent augments. You can use the grapple hook to reach health upgrades that you couldn't reach before. And you can also use the grapple hook or the melee attack or any of the upgrades to effectively speedrun your way through earlier biomes. And it's not just that you can collect these Metroidvania stuff. There are other permanent collectibles and weapons that upgrades that can be unlocked and do persist run to run as well. And while there are no checkpoints per se, the game is 100% tracking your progress, and that's either done automatically through you unlocking these Metroidvania elements, or it is actually just paying attention, and it's happy to fast track you closer to your next objective. And we're going to talk more about the good and the bad of that a little later. And this sounds like a lot of persistence in a rogue-style game. And, well, it is, but the core of the genre is still intact. I mean, if you die, you're going to go right back to the start. And the knowledge that you gained and the familiarity with the mechanics and the world are ultimately going to win over any Metroidvania unlock or permanent weapon upgrade at the end of the day. It still is a skill-based game, and it still does largely require you, the player, to get better rather than just grinding through and gradually increasing things. The increases help, but it still does rely on you, the player, learning how to exist optimally in this rogue world. A few other things which don't relate to the rogue genre, but I think set the game apart from other rogue games, start with the level design. These biomes are big, they are sprawling, and they are thick.
Mamma mia!
I mean, it's really, really, really cool roaming these spaces. In a time where all these rogue games are usually indie, small, little guys, it's crazy seeing these huge, huge biomes that are just massive and sprawling. It really, the desert biome in particular, feels like you are actually just roaming what could effectively be an endless desert. And since we're talking about size, well, we got to talk about length, am I right, fellas? These runs are extremely long. Like, if you're not speedrunning and you wanted to beat every single boss in every single biome in one run, which is not required, but there's nothing stopping you from doing it, I would estimate that the run would take about 5 hours to complete. Most runs, I would say, last close to 2+ hours, and that puts a lot of pressure on you. I mean, if you succeed, then you feel absolutely brilliant. But if you spend 2 hours building up to a boss just to get absolutely slammed down, well, let's just say people who complain about Dark Souls throwing you back to the beginning of a bonfire are definitely not going to like being sent back 2+ hours to get back to that boss that just stomped you. And there's also an active reload, kind of like Gears of War, and I guess it's now clear that Risk of Rain 2 developer team is a fan of Returnal. And the last neat thing is this adrenaline meter. The more enemies you kill without getting hit, the more buffed Celine will get. Her adrenaline will increase. And this will do things like shorten the active reload. Your window will get bigger. It will give you a stronger melee. It'll give you better vision. That lets you kind of see enemies through walls. It has lots of cool buffs. And in a bullet hell game, it just adds a smidge more pressure to dodging those hundreds of projectiles coming your way at any given second. So Returnal is certainly a unique game. It's not just a copy-paste. They do a lot to push the genre forward, and most of it does land pretty well. So there's a lot of references in Returnal, and I'm not going to go over all of them, mostly because I don't know all of them, but I do think it's worth appreciating the few that stood out to me in particular. So I want to go through some of the non-gaming media, as well as some of the gaming media that kind of reminded me of Returnal in one way or another, or vice versa. So the first would be the Alien/Prometheus series. And the aesthetics of the world are very, very clearly calling from Alien, especially your ship, the technology, especially the first biome. For me in particular, really reminds me of Prometheus, and just the intelligent entities that were there before you have a lot of familiarity to Prometheus, we'll just say. The protagonist, Celine, definitely mirrors Ripley to me in many aspects, and I know that that character has gone through a lot more than Celine has in terms of adaptations over the years, but I do see similarities, and the lore left behind, to me, is very Prometheus adjacent. And next up would be Annihilation, and in this way, I think both the book and the movie are particularly relevant. The book is non-linear-ish, and so is the movie. The non-linear nature and the visuals really do just remind me of Returnal in many, many, many ways, and I would definitely recommend either the book or the movie. So Lovecraftian elements are definitely being utilized pretty much to the full extent in the enemy design. Lots of Lovecraftian elements in those enemies. That's more of just a cool aesthetic thing. There's a lot of Greek mythology stuff, and I don't want to go into details, no spoilers, but Greek mythology connects in a lot of ways to the story of the game. All the bosses are named after Greek mythology, and you yourself, Selene, your ship Helios, the world Atropos, all of those are worth, doing a quick Google of what they are as you're kind of going through the story and piecing together the little nods to Greek mythology. And another no spoiler would be the movie Moon, but yeah, you can definitely see recurring themes. That one's more of a no spoiler for the movie Moon more than the game Returnal, but yeah. So as for games, Nier, the Nier series, specifically the 3D bullet hell style, the orbs are very reminiscent, and the general bullet hell style, you can definitely tell that the devs at Housemarque were looking at Nier when they were looking to adapt their 2D bullet hell up into the 3D bullet hell. And next is Metroid, and actually in my Metroid Dread review, I specifically said it would be very cool if there was a 3D style Metroid, kind of like this, 3D third person, that is using Metroidvania elements and using rogue style gameplay. I think that would work really well with the Metroid world, and well, this is essentially that. It's a sci-fi game that's using Metroidvania aspects in a roguelike game. So there's definitely some the Metroidvania in particular is what reflects in the Metroid IP in Returnal, but I do think Metroid could borrow something from Returnal going forward. And I thought that this moment at the end of Ocarina of Time, going up to fight Ganon, or Ganondorf, the kickoff to the finale of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, was very, very reflective of this particular moment in Returnal. It's a bit harder to articulate why this one is a callback, but I'm going to pull it from Housemarque themselves when they were reacting to a speedrun that IGN hosted. They themselves called this particular boss an homage to their own work, Resogun. So that's kind of cool. And yeah, I mean, almost every detail in Returnal is in reference to other source material, and sometimes it's just a simple neat nod. Sometimes this helps to articulate the story, like the Greek mythology aspects, and other times it's just a perfect mashup of many different amazing pieces of art from different media coming together to create this new piece of art. And it does really come together wonderfully for what I think is one of my favorite game aesthetics in, frankly, years. But now I want to highlight what really stands out in Returnal, and, well, what stands out in a bad way. Because Returnal does have a duality of things, that really excel in things that simply left me scratching my head. Let's start with the positive, and let's start with good. The presentation of Returnal is simply amazing. This is a next-gen game only on PS5, and it shows. And it's not just the graphics, which are great, but it's the art direction, and it's one of the most aesthetically pleasing games I've played in quite some time. Some of these levels are truly awe-inspiring, and I'm going to go back to the scale of it. You really do feel like a tiny little Celine in this massive alien world, and it's just beautiful what they've come up with, especially knowing that it's procedurally generated. Handcrafted rooms, but the way that they're able to come together in a coherent way is just really impressive every single run. And the graphical prowess of the game combined with these expansive rooms is kind of how I think this game is going to set itself apart in the genre of rogue games in the future, where all these other rogue games are usually small 2D games. I think the fact that this is just so expansive is going to be something to remember about this game, going from these tiny indie rooms to these massive open deserts. And I mean, just look at this stuff. And it's not just the graphics, like I said, it really is the art direction. All of the previously mentioned inspirations create such a rich world. The atmosphere, simply amazing, A+. And the music / sound design just simply bangs. I bet you've never heard Don't Fear the Reaper like this. It's atmospheric when it needs to be, and it's perfectly punchy during those crazy bullet hell boss fights. I remember when Mark Cerny did the PS5 Architect talk, and he talked about using ray tracing tech to create 3D audio. I remember thinking to myself, that is about the dumbest gimmick I have ever heard. But, well, I was wrong. The soundstage in this game is just amazing, and whether I was using TV speakers, headphones, or earbuds, the game always sounded superb. Speaking of PS5 tech gimmicks, the DualSense is put to really good use here. It's easily the best use of the controller I've had, and it's only second to Astrobot. And they put the speaker to good use for indicating when your alt-fire cooldown is ready to go, which is a nice relief from the last game I used that featured the controller speaker. The adaptive triggers allow for essentially 3 buttons for each index finger. You get your bumpers, and the triggers now have 2 states of depression, which is kind of like me. Of course, unless you hold your controller like an absolute monster, then you're going to be using your middle finger for those 2 levels of depression. The Taptic engine is really good. I mean, you can literally feel the rain in the controller, and it all works really well, and I have always had a lot of faith in the DualSense, but I am pretty much solidified that these haptic triggers need to be a staple in gaming. For me, they're about the biggest innovation since the analog stick. While Returnal is truly remarkable from a technical standpoint, there are some missteps, in my opinion, in other places, and we should probably start with the story. I understand that telling a story in a rogue game can be difficult. I mean, you have to justify the loop, or you don't have to justify the loop. You have to justify the randomness of the level design and the variation of or inconsistencies, or you can just ignore that. And you have to weave a coherent story around your repeating death. Or, like I said, you can just not and let ludonarrative dissonance, our favorite gaming word, take over. And it is certainly not easy to set up for telling a compelling story, this particular structure that has to come with a rogue style. But rogue games have told solid enough stories in the past. Or rogue games stick to telling simpler stories and ignore the roguelike aspect. Or the game mostly forgoes storytelling, but games are able to emphasize lore, and that is honestly good enough, because in these games the gameplay tends to be the most important part. But Returnal tries to go all in on the storytelling, and in some way they do succeed. They justify the variations and the loop mechanics, and there's extensive audio logs and lore to establish the world, and perhaps where it succeeds most is mirroring Celine's frustration. It's reflected directly back onto the player. Your frustration of continuously dying is mimicked by her in her audio logs. But in other ways, the story just kind of falls flat. First of all, it was extremely predictable, and I'm not particularly savvy at figuring out stories. I feel like I just called about everything in this game like before the halfway point, and it's a bit too heavy-handed on the foreshadowing for me. There are these first-person house sequences which provide a kind of first-person exploration to attempt to flesh out the story and make you connect more with Celine. And while they were interesting at first, once I kind of knew exactly what the story was, it just hurt the pacing of the run. And I think they were supposed to be Kojima-esque PT-style horror, but in the end they just weren't even remotely scary. And it's hard to explain why the story fell flat, but I ultimately think the world Celine was in on Atropos was much, much more interesting than what they attempted to ground you with on her Earth story as a character. It was just far less interesting to me. And while there are some crazy fourth wall moments, it just doesn't come together as a coherent whole for me. Honestly, I think if they dropped the Earth stuff and just stuck with the lore of Atropos, or kept the Earth stuff more ambiguous, it would have succeeded more. And I'm also a little bit miffed in the UI in this game. Now, I know this is going to be pretty nitpicky, because most of it does work, but some things are poorly explained or not explained at all. And I'm not talking about mechanics that I think should be kept hidden. Those are totally fine. But, for example, I don't fully understand guns. I mean, each run you build up a weapon rank, which lets you get better guns. But then when you die, the rank resets, but there are persistent upgrades to the guns based on you using them, so that's kind of weird. But anyways, I often found that a rank 16 gun could easily outwork a rank 20-something gun if the spec was right on it. And as you work towards these permanent unlocks for each gun, they can add to a random pool of upgrades for those guns and it's confusing. It's confusing and it's not explained well, to me at least. And each gun has random attributes, and the gun it's just needlessly confusing. And I really just picked up the gun that felt like it was succeeding, and if there was another drop, I would shoot it a couple times and see if I liked it and decide on the fly. But I really could not make out a lot from reading and comparing the specs and understanding, how weapon rank related to the attributes that the gun rolled. It was weird to me, that's all. And you either have to pause the game to see what item you have, like your active item, your L1 item. You have to pause the game to see what that's going to do, or you can be standing near another item. And I just wish that there was a quick explanation if you swapped between your slots, because the names can be kind of ambiguous. And they know that they need to explain what they do, because when you stand next to something to pick it up, it gives you a direct comparison. So they know that you don't really know what it does. And the map is really good, but some of the symbols are just too similar to others. And some of the symbols are actually the same symbol, but they just use a slightly different hue. And my eyes honestly had trouble identifying which hue. The hues were like too close for me to know what the type of drop was. And I also wish if you had interacted with an item drop or a material builder or something, if you interacted with the thing, that when you pulled it up on the map, it would tell you what it is. Because what I would end up doing is, I would clear a biome or whatever, very much like in The Binding of Isaac or Risk of Rain or whatever. You clear the biome and you're like, okay, I know that there's some stuff laying around. I want to go and, see if I can like min-max and spec things out. But you just kind of find yourself aimlessly wandering through the whole map, where it could have just told you exactly what is there. And like I said, these maps are big, so it's not like trivial to go through all the rooms. So you really would kind of have to remember what was where they could have told you what was there after you interacted with it. And that's kind of a bummer. Those are a few nitpicks, but they do add up. In terms of Returnal as a rogue game, every rogue game that I've played has had the options to dramatically change your character. Binding of Isaac, your body grotesquely morphs as you augment him, and a lucky run can yield godlike results. Risk of Rain 2 similarly changes your character appearance and attacks, and in some cases completely transforms your character. And unfortunately, nothing like that happens in Returnal. All of your augments are basically stat tweaks. You're boosting your health. You're increasing your protection 10%. You get a shield on next hit. You increase your damage 5% for every adrenaline level. And yeah, you can pick up some parasites that do kind of like stick to your body, but hardly changes your appearance. And I guess the upgrades are a little uninspired at times. They just seem kind of lame. And while there are certainly powerful artifacts, I never found anything that like stood out in my head as a very unique, cool concept. And speaking of the genre, is Returnal a rogue game? And I know that I've spent, at this point, 20 plus minutes explaining that it is, but just hear me out. So, to complete Act 2, which is rolling the credits of the main ending, there's another ending after that, but the main ending, I did it in 14 hours, and I died 15 times. And that's like the normal amount of times a person would die in a normal video game to me. The run that I beat the game in, I beat 2/3 of the game in one clean run. And I beat 4 bosses back to back to back to back to beat that whole game, basically. And this was not a god tier run. And I am pretty sure I could replicate it. And I'm not trying to show off or anything. I'm really not. I just think once you figure it out, it's like very trivial. And if you do die, you don't need to fight previous bosses or visit previous biomes. You can buff yourself by visiting those biomes or beating those bosses, but you never have to. You can pretty much just keep pushing forward in progression of the game. So that's interesting. You are essentially given checkpoints, and they can fast track you to where you just died, and you can actually make save states for yourself, which is it's interesting. And actually, if you die after the halfway point in the game, they just start you back at the halfway point of the game. So to me, this honestly feels less like a rogue game at times. I mean, it is. You still get the random levels and the random buffs, and your progress still resets, but to me it just feels more like an old school style game. It's just a game with less generous checkpoints at times. Now, I see the issue. The way Returnal works, if you had to clear all the bosses and you had to clear all the biomes every time, a non-speedrunner, like I said, would take about 5 hours to beat, which for a game that could not suspend runs at launch is not sustainable. But I do struggle with all the generous checkpointing and being rewarded as you progress in the game. And it's like I said, there's nothing stopping you from challenging yourself and doing a full biome or a full boss run, but that's definitely not the way the devs intended this game to be played. So it's interesting to contemplate. And I think for rogue diehards this will be a put-off, but I do think maybe for newcomers to the genre this will kind of serve as a stopgap between the rogue genre and more traditional games. There's a lot to like about this game, and I have a few complaints with Housemarque's interpretation of the genre, but let's try to sum all this up. So this is a very good first effort. It is damn fun to play. It is a visual and audio feast, amazing art, amazing visuals, and it's proof that the rogue genre has a place in the AAA space, and that it is, in fact, possible. But from my experience with rogue games, I see room for improvement. However, Housemarque's attempt is unique, and I respect that. Too often it did feel diluted to the point of just being a normal game with limited checkpoints. It's an objective-driven game, easy to skip lots of content, arguably too easy, and things never get too insane item-wise. The structure and the length of the runs just doesn't make me want to do runs over and over again, and too often the rogue elements just seem to take a back seat, which is a bummer because I do truly think that they are the best part. So I have hope for the future of AAA rogue games, and I think Returnal was a solid first effort. I also love seeing new IPs. And yeah, I can't wait to see how this genre continues to grow with this new breakthrough. And I think Housemarque has done a solid job and can't wait to see what they do next. That's all for me, guys. I'll catch you next time.